Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, Numerics with Nadia. I've been a private tutor for math for the past 7 years, and during my time tutoring, I learned how to teach all different levels of math to my students in a motivating and fun way. My focus has always been on building a strong foundation for my students, so I thought I would share videos starting from grade 5 up to grade 12. And in this first video, starting in grade 5, I wanted to cover what fractions are because I feel like that is where a lot of students start to get confused. So we'll be starting there and then we'll be working through a lot of other concepts through algebra, geometry, algebra 2, trig, pre-calc, calc, and statistics. So stay with me, but for now, let's get started on fractions. So fractions are never a fun topic for most of my students. When we first start out, they just say, oh my gosh, I'm so bad at fractions, I don't want to do it. But I'm here to hopefully make fractions a little bit less scary. So let's tackle what fractions are, how we can differentiate them, and all of that stuff. So to start, what are fractions? So one thing to note about my lessons are I'm going to tackle teaching these topics in different methods because some people are visual learners and so on. So to start with fractions, we're going to learn this conceptually. And the way we're going to tackle this is we're going to start with what we're familiar with. So up until this point, we should be familiar with whole numbers, right? We've probably added, subtracted, multiplied, divided whole numbers. So let's compare these whole numbers to fractions. So let's go through some examples of whole numbers. Feel free to come up with some examples on your own, on your end as well, but some examples that I have are 5, 200, 60, and so on, right? Any whole number that you can think of is a good example here. Now we can go through and list some fractions. Now, if this is our first time, we might not be familiar with fractions yet, but we'll go through some examples. So we have 1 over 2, 2 over 3, 4 over 9, and so on. And the one thing you'll notice here is you can write this in different ways. In the first examples with the 1 over 2, we have it written as like a slant. You can also write it with a horizontal kind of division bar, and they are completely equivalent and the same. So whichever version you like to draw better, whatever looks better for you or works better for you, you can write it that way. Now, the key difference we notice between our whole number examples and our fraction examples is that whole numbers are greater than 1, right? And fractions are between 0 and 1. So now that we've gone over whole numbers, right, something we're familiar with, and some examples of fractions, which we'll dive more into, let's go over the components of a fraction, right? Components, what makes up a fraction? What are we supposed to look for? So to be able to show you guys this, we'll do it through an example. So let's start with 1 over 2. The way we also refer to that is 1/2, and we will go through later visually why it represents a half. But for now, we'll start with 1 over 2 or 1/2, and this is going to be split up into a numerator. The top number above the bar is the numerator, and the denominator is on the bottom. Another way to think about this is the part. So the numerator is part of the whole, which is our denominator. And this will make more sense as we go through more examples as well and as we do it visually. But for now, numerator is on the top, denominator is on the bottom, and then another way to refer to it is the part of the whole thing. So to go through this visually, I have an example already written out for us. The first example is 2. So the way I've shown this is with 2 circular counters. You can think of them as anything you like. They can be pieces of candy, cookies, a pizza, whatever type of example you like, you can go with. But the main thing here is we have the full thing, right? We have 2 of them, and 2 would be a whole number. We have our 2 counters. So 2 is a whole number, and we show that visually with 2 full circles. We're familiar with counting, we're familiar with whole numbers, so let's now go into the example with our fractions, okay? So now we have a circle that's half colored green and half colored blue, right? The part that's shaded, all of our counters are green. The part that's shaded represents the 1 because it's one piece of the circle. And the whole thing represents the 2 because the whole thing is cut into 2 pieces. So this would be our fraction, and the fraction would be 1/2 here because the part that's shaded is the 1. The whole circle was cut into 2 parts, so part over whole, our fraction would be 1/2. So now that we've done one quick example on just visually what whole numbers look like compared to fractions, let's now go over what the difference between whole numbers and fractions are. So the difference between a whole number and a fraction is that the denominator of a whole number is always 1. While the denominator of a fraction can vary. Now you might be wondering, what does Miss Nadia mean? What does this look like? We're gonna try this out in a few examples, so let's get excited and let's do some examples. So now, just like we did before, we're going to do a few examples of whole numbers and fractions just to really get down to the difference between them visually, because we already went over it conceptually. So now let's try it ourselves by making diagrams for these examples. And then hopefully we'll really understand the difference here and we'll be able to carry that forward to future lessons. So here, let's just do 4. We can do 1/4. We can do 2/3. And let's do 2 as well. So it's a fun little exercise. You can pause the video here and see if you can determine which ones are whole numbers, which ones are fractions, and we're gonna go through and draw them as well. So for 4 is a whole number, right? There's an invisible little denominator there that we don't see, but it is 1. So I just want us to get that notation down. It's gonna help us in the future. So 4 is the same as 4/1. And now I'll put in our counters. So again, you can think of these counters as any example you like, but for now, let's just plan that these are candies. So we wanted to represent 4. We're gonna go through, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. The whole thing is shaded in. 4 is our whole number, and that's how we would draw it out, right? This is our basics. We should be familiar with this. Now let's move on to our next example. We had 1/4, or as we refer to it, it's normally 1/4. 1/4 has a denominator other than 1, right? So this would be a fraction. And the way that we think of fractions, right, it's those two ways we referred to before. We can either think of it as numerator over denominator, which is what it's most commonly going to be reflected as, or sometimes in the future in word problems and stuff that we're going to do, we can also think as 1/4 as a part over a whole. Now we put our candy in here, and remember we can only have 1/4 of this. So I'm going to go through and split this circle, this candy, into 4 pieces, right? We kind of have like a little grid going on here, and we only can have 1 of it, right? The numerator represents the part that we can have, and that would be 1. The denominator is the amount of pieces we cut it into, which in this one was 4. So that's why we made it into a little grid. We had the 1/4, the 1 part that we can have is our numerator, the denominator is our whole. So we're gonna shade in that section black. Be patient with me. We're gonna shade that part in, and that will be our diagram for this part of the problem. Next, we're gonna have another fraction to go through. How do we know that this is a fraction? We have 2/3 or 2/3, right? The denominator is something other than 1, so we know that this is a fraction. And again, repetition is so important here. The more we write things out in the correct form, the easier it's going to be to dig in our brains later and remember what everything means. So I know I'm repeating myself a lot here, but it's really going to help us learn these concepts. So again, 2/3, the number on the top is our numerator, number on the bottom is our denominator, or we can think of it as a part over a whole again, right? So we have one candy again, right? We only have one candy because these fractions are between 0 and 1. I'm going to go through and split this up into 3 pieces. Kind of looks like a little peace sign, right? We're splitting it into 3 pieces because our denominator, or the whole, is 3. So we have 3 pieces. We can have 2 of them. So we're going to go through and shade in 2 portions of this fraction to represent the 2/3. Now that we've fully shaded this in, it might be a little bit difficult to see where those original 3 lines, right, that made our peace sign were, but we had our 3 pieces, we shaded in 2, so we know that our diagram works here, right? And now for our final example, part D, we had 2 written. And 2, again, we don't see a denominator, right? We have that invisible little 1, which we'll write out again. But 2 represents a whole number, and we'll write it out as 2/1 just for practice, just to get it in our brains, because I promise it's going to help us later. So whole numbers, again, we should be familiar with. This is repeating ourselves, and this is just for a final review. Our 2/1 will be representing the 1, 2. So that would be the last problem. Now we have reached the end of lesson 1. I hope that this has cleared up. I know it was the basics, but I hope it's cleared up the differences between whole numbers and fractions, what fractions are, what it looks like visually, what the differences are between whole numbers and fractions, right? So please let me know in the comments if you have any questions at all, and I'm excited to see you guys next time.